Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today as we celebrate Margaret Ellen Wright's life. And there is such a rich tapestry that we have to actually share with you today. Could we please ask you by standing and take your order of service, and we're going to open by singing a wonderful hymn, When Peace Like a River. If you'd all be upstanding, please. Thank you. Would you all be seated, please? And thank you very much, Len, for your organist playing. Thank you. Welcome, family. Welcome, friends. And thank you on behalf of the family as we're here to honour the life of Margaret Ellen Wright. As you were aware, a remarkable woman sitting amongst you as you came in, and I heard a number of stories about this incredible human being that has touched your life in some way. Described by her children as kind, loving, self-sacrificing. And she's been lost to us today, and that is why we're here to celebrate the life of Margaret. It is okay to feel sad, it's a normal emotion, and express your grief today. But as I sat down with Marilyn, she also said to me, Dean, it is also okay to express your joy and happiness, knowing that Margaret had a wonderful life, incredible service to many people. So we say goodbye to Margaret, a wife, a mother, a daughter, an auntie, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and I know a friend to you all. It's a privilege to be entrusted with such a service. Dean Gregson, who you met when you came in, and myself, my name is Dean also. We acknowledge the privilege to be able to serve the family and this wonderful community at this point in time. So we say thank you to the family for this honour. It's a challenging day for everyone. I think for many of us there's a space that's now empty. And nobody can ever fill that space, being such a remarkable person. So she leaves this empty space. And I think meeting many people along my journey, nothing ever really prepares us for this. Nothing prepares us for these moments. But it's today when we come together and we sit side by side, here to pay our respects, but also here to support one another with love and affection. What are the right words to say at such a time? Sometimes I'm lost. I meet so many families. And to sit down with Marilyn, who was just full of just such good cheer and wonderful memories about her mother, and reading the many emails from the other children, I understand that we were blessed to meet her. But what do you say to the family? What do you say to the children? I think sometimes you don't need to say anything. We know. You may just need to look in their eyes, or perhaps just hold their hand for a moment, or even perhaps give them an embrace, which can communicate so much more. To the family we say, to our deepest sympathy at your loss. But Margaret lives on, doesn't she? She lives on in our hearts and she lives on in our minds because she's much loved. Margaret was a protector, a defender. She stood up for what she believed in and she cared for you. She was a hard worker. She had an incredible work ethic. She always had something to do and somewhere to go for the benefit of one another. She lived by the principle, or she was principle driven, and she was just and fair in all aspects of her life. And I'm sure she will continue on in our conversations during the day. And it's these conversations that shed light and guide us and inspire us and move us to higher purpose. So we will carry Margaret within. And this will be part of Margaret's legacy. I have the privilege today of sharing the family's tribute or eulogy of Margaret. And for many of you, some of these stories will not be known to you. So I encourage you to sit back with an open heart and ears and listen to this remarkable human being's story as I share this with you. Margaret loved her family and friends. She was born in Port Moresby, August 10th, 1928. Her parents, Pastor George and Christina Engelbrecht, having been sent to New Guinea as missionaries shortly after their wedding. Some wedding gift. When Margaret was 18 months, her parents became very ill with malaria and went by steamer back to the Adventist Sanitarium in Wahronga, Sydney. They both recovered and returned to Christchurch, New Zealand, where in April 1931, Anne, the first of two sisters, was born. When Margaret was 3, her father returned to New Hebrides, known now as Vanuatu, as the headmaster of the training school at Aor, and then later became the superintendent of the New Hebrides mission field. A second sister, Jan, arrived to complete the family in November 1933. As he had a large area to cover, her dad was often away on the mission boat, and some of these occasions were during the hurricane season. And as there were no two-way radios in those days, prayer and faith in God was most important, as it wasn't until the boat came home into sight that they knew he was safe. In the hurricane season, when the barometer reached a certain reading, they would batten down the hatches. The only light they had was, as the winds howled and shook the house, was from the kerosene lanterns. When the winds died down, they would go out and survey the damage. Although the trees would be broken and the beach full of debris, the house always stayed intact, which for Margaret was always grateful. Sometimes they accompanied their dad on his shorter trips, and on one of these they were moving one of the other missionaries to Aoba. The boat was loaded down with the things and cabin was full, so her dad threw a thin mattress on top of the cabin. Margaret and her sisters lay on top of this. Dad put a tarp over them and tied them down so that they wouldn't go overboard. On the way over, a storm came up and it was a very rough ride. When they arrived, Margaret remembers her skin being wrinkled from being soaked as the water constantly broke over them. The cow that was also on board did make it to land but didn't survive the trip. Margaret felt that this was one up for her, that she had lived when the cow didn't. Her mother also tended the sick, along with being there at the births of many new lives. When Margaret became old enough, she helped her mother, putting fomentations on natives, clearing out sores and helping out. However, she was required. So even though she wasn't aware of it, Margaret started her medical work quite early. Life here was also a paradise for Margaret and her sisters, as she had many wonderful memories this time. These included going to sleep on Friday night, listening to the natives singing in beautiful harmony in the church nearby, or going out in the outrigger canoe to view the coral, catching fish to let them go, swimming and exploring the bush around them. In the morning they had to go to school by correspondence, but in the afternoons they either worked in the garden with the natives' help or had it off to enjoy themselves. It was also Margaret's job to milk the cow, and she would do it so slowly so the cream would rise to the top. Margaret loved the cream, and so she would cut a stem from a pawpaw tree about 8 inches long. It is hollow inside, and she would carefully lift one corner of the cream's crust and suck away till she had close to half of an inch of cream. Don't make it like that anymore. This This would make the crust on the top sink like a volcano, but Grandma never caught on, and Margaret took great delight in that she never did. Margaret sewed her first dress when she was 8 and was to continue to sew until very late in her life. Margaret was very skilled, not only at sewing, but also at fitting the garment on you, so when finished, you looked and felt great. Margaret was later in life to supplement the family income with her sewing. Although still living in New Zealand when Jan was married, Margaret made both her wedding dress and 2 bridesmaids' dresses. When it arrived, all Jan had to do was take the waist in an inch, and that was because she had lost weight. Margaret also made her daughter Marilyn's wedding dress. Marilyn didn't give her a pattern, but instead a picture in a magazine and photos of a train she liked on a dress in a bridal shop window. Needless to say, Margaret did a beautiful job. And many of the dresses you will see Margaret in as an adult in our photo tribute, Margaret made herself, and Christina and Marilyn were teenagers before they had bought an outfit. World War II broke out when Margaret was 13 and the family returned to Sydney, and after a year they were transferred to Melbourne. Here Margaret was bullied at school. She was an A and a B+ student, and the boys and some of the girls didn't like a missionary child being smarter than them. It was also while attending this school that the schoolyard pranks saw Margaret fall heavily to the ground, damaging her lower back, an injury that was to plague her for the rest of her life. From here, the family transferred to Bundaberg for 6 months and then to Ayr. Margaret was 15. Money was scarce, so she went to work helping, cleaning houses, picking tomatoes, picking potatoes and bagging them, riding her trusty bicycle out to each job. This was tough on her back, but fortunately a secretarial job became available at the conference office in Townsville. Margaret boarded during the week, coming home on Friday afternoon. On Friday evenings, Margaret and her dad and sisters would sing hymns as a quartet. It was during this time that Fred Wright came to North Queensland selling books to earn money for college. However, he was slack at filling his invoices, so Margaret found him at the camp meeting and told him off in no uncertain terms. Fred returned to Avondale in New South Wales, and Margaret, now 17, went that same year working in the college kitchen and cleaning houses to pay her way. She sang in the choir, but her greatest joy was to be chosen to sing in the 8-part, 60-voice a cappella symphonic choir as a second alto. This meant she often sang the bass note. God gave her the ability to sing any 2-note octaves below C and almost the same above. She was also the only untrained voice to sing in Professor Greer's choir. He was a brilliant conductor who had came out from America at the time. Due to illness, Margaret didn't graduate from college, and after recovering went to Sydney, where she worked as a head cashier in a hardware, electrical, jewellery store, as well as a waitress at the Sanitarium Health Food Cafe in Hunter Street. It was during this time Fred and Margaret started courting and were married in Townsville in November 1949 before returning to live in Sydney. Christina, Jan 1951, and Lindsay, September 1952, were born here, and when Lindsay was 4 months, Fred accepted the position to be the head of woodwork department at Longburn Missionary College near Palmerston North, New Zealand. Wages were low, and Margaret turned to dressmaking to help out. Marilyn was born here July 1954, as well as John, February 1956. When John was 4, Margaret went to work in the factory where she made Legionnaire caps. You were paid piecemeal and needed to make 9 caps per day. Margaret made 49, so she put her on a wage. The boss then decided he wanted a brim put on the cap, but she refused. And it was impossible to do, so he sacked her. The office girls told her to come back to work the next day. Anyway, and when she did, after another discussion, he asked her to make 30-foot tents. These are not the lightweight tents that we're used to today, but ridge-capped tents made for the army of a very heavy tent material, and the poles and ropes were sewn into them. He showed her how to make them, and when he came back at the end of the day, she had made 3. Margaret was the only one who could make a bonus on them. Around this time, Margaret noticed that Christina, now aged 9, spent a lot of time listening to the college girls practice piano, and against Fred's wishes, used some of the money she earned to buy a piano for Christina and pay for music lessons. When Christina was 10, the organist at the Danavaki church was ill, and Margaret asked Christina could she play the hymns that day. Christina thought everyone who'd learnt music could do this, and she was happy to help out. Margaret recognised her daughter's talent, and she always made sure she had a piano and there was money to pay for lessons for her. Christina went on to get a diploma in teaching and continues even now to teach, as well as play for singers, concerts, musicals, many of which Margaret was able to attend and enjoy. Even after Margaret went to Allura Lodge, she was able to continue enjoying Christina's playing, as she now regularly plays for the residents there. In her spare time, Margaret was secretary to the Dorcas Welfare Society, which helped care for the needy. It was made up of a combination of 7 churches in the area. While working on the college property, Margaret used her flower arranging talent to make sprays for the student girls on special occasions and graduation, and this was when you wired every flower individually and then the whole arrangement was wired together. When Christina and Marilyn were married, Margaret made their bouquets as well as the attendants. Margaret also learnt cake icing, and this was when you made every petal of the roses before putting them together and piped beautiful lacework on the sides of the cakes. She made quite a few wedding cakes in her time, including Christina's and her sister's aunt. Margaret was still in New Zealand when Anne was married, and the cake was carefully packed into a large trunk, and her mum came over by boat and took it back to Australia. The cake arrived in perfect condition. When John wanted to buy his first bike, his father, Fred, was against it. But Margaret, to the rescue, went with him and signed the papers so he could buy it. Margaret talked him into it. Fred drove her around Sydney on the back of his bike when they were courting. Her reasoning for John to have a bike was that you couldn't do things on the back of a bike that you could do in the back seat of a car. Margaret was very practical. Fred left the college in 1960 and then went on to the farm at Coomera. As well as looking after the family, Margaret made blouses and white pyjamas for the hospital, taught dressmaking at the state school, drove the shepherds out to the jeep where the sheep were, and then took the jeep back to town to pick up tins of petrol, as well as at times helped out on the farm, although, fortunately, not necessarily all on the same day. They only lived here for a year, but before returning to Australia in 1961 and eventually settled in Murwillumbah. Margaret again took up dressmaking to supplement the family income. In 1966 they moved to 309 Chevelham Road, Palmwoods, now known as 39 Cheviot Road, where Fred built the printing business to print his books. Margaret helped out in the office and learnt to run the printing press when needed, but her health was not good and she suffered with migraines. Charlie Morgan discovered reflexology and practised on her. Eventually, not only did she get better, but she also learnt how to do it. The family was now living quite a bit of acreage, so Margaret decided to grow gladiolas to sell. One of her local clients was the Catholic Church, who would place a large order for white gladiolas at Easter. Margaret's gladiolas were predominantly pink, so she would combine what she had with the flowers from the local growers to make up the order. One year she was very happy to see that she had enough gladiolas to fill her order by herself. That year the Catholic Church decided they all wanted pink. Around this time, Margaret also decided to enter the Nambour show in the bakery and flower section. One of the sections she entered was for an iced chocolate cake. However, in the middle of the baking, it ran out of gas. Margaret sent Larry outside to quickly change the tanks over, but when the cake was baked, one side hadn't risen quite as high as the other. She very carefully levelled it off and iced it and got first prize for it and had quite a chuckle over it and wondered what the judges would have said if they had have knew what happened. She also received a second prize for her floral arrangement in a teaspoon and first prize for her gladioli. As her children grew older, Margaret started to travel with Fred and people started asking for advice with their health problems. So she shared with them her knowledge of poulticing and reflexology, and in 1968 she was asked to start a medical program. Friends gave her money to get started, and it was used to raise up the old house at 309 and build in underneath it. Elias Hunter and Les Morgan came to lend a hand, and it was raised with jacks, lumps of 4x4 and pallets. They had just got up to the height they wanted, and a storm came through. A lot of prayers were said, and the house was still up there the next morning. In 1972, Margaret attended a massage course at Simon Schott's school. He had recently moved to Sydney and decided his first class were candidates for colonics, and when Margaret attended his second class, he decided she was the right person to do this. She said no, but he persisted. Larry set the machine up and Margaret did her first colonic without a demo. Her third patient recognised the machine, so she said, "Good, you can give me some tips." The machinery was very primitive in those days, but people received benefits from them and the demand grew by word of mouth. Peter Wilson was a big help to her coming in after his workday to do the men clients. Margaret also taught quite a few others to do, and many of whom are still doing this today. Margaret, well known in the area for her knowledge and her ability to help with health problems. In 1976, the first run of Practical Home Healing went to print and Margaret received an honorary degree of Doctor of Naturopathy from the Queensland Institute of Natural Science in appreciation for the services rendered. In the same year, Marilyn also did Simon's massage course. In the practical exam part 2 of the verbal questions that was asked was, if after giving a person who doesn't know what is wrong with them a full body massage, you don't know what is wrong with them, what do you do? The answer is send them to a doctor. Marilyn didn't know this, but after some thought said, I would ring my mother. Schott laughed, but she got full points for her answer. Over the following years, Margaret also set up and ran and helped to run colonics clinics in Brisbane, Udalo and Mooloolah. She also practiced her natural healing on her children, and at some stage of their growing, each of them wore a potato poultice somewhere on them. In 1978, Marilyn ended up in hospital after an accident, not any accident, it was actually a hang gliding accident, which left her upper right arm swollen and she was unable to move it. The doctors thought physio might help, so she was asked to go home. Once there, Margaret started with the potato poultice, followed by a cabbage, then charcoal and linseed poultice, and also massaged the arm with comfrey ointment, during this continually for several days. Marilyn was able to go back to work a week later and believes that without her mother's poulticing, she would have the use of her arm today if it wasn't for Mum's attention. As Margaret approached 65, she decided to retire and leave it to the younger generation to carry on the work she had begun, but it was not to be so. Some of the staff at the Living Valley Springs begged her to come and teach them what she had learnt, and she agreed, thinking she could teach them and then she could retire. However, she was just finished teaching them, and another group from there also wanted to be taught, so Margaret continued. They then decided it would be a good idea to get her school accredited with the government, so she worked her way through a huge red tape and paperwork required it to do this. Margaret was finding it too difficult to make the trip to Living Valley Springs, so she asked Oriel to help her find a place in Gympie. There were enough people up there to support the clinic and massage school, and the students from Living Valley Springs were able to come to there as well. While working here, Margaret turned 70. The senior staff planned to throw a surprise birthday, only to discover she was planning to go to Sydney for the weekend. In order to get Margaret to stay, they told her that they were having a dinner for her, but she wasn't expecting all the other people who turned up on the day to wish her well. Lila had gone through her address book and sent invitations to everyone in it. They came in like Brown's cows, but this probably worked out best, as Margaret was able to catch up with them each as they came in. And she had a wonderful day. In 2003, Margaret decided it was time to retire and handed her massage school to Rodney Flint, but continued to help out and make the students' papers till even this became too much for her. After Fred had passed away in 1997, Margaret found the property too much to deal with, and in 1998 put it up for sale. David and Beth Beeden initially rented the property for 6 months, and in this time fell in love with Mum, where they were very happy to have her stay, and when they bought the property 6 months later. Margaret's children were very happy with this and allowed her to continue to live on this beautiful property where she had lived the past 30-odd years without a worry for its care. In December 2011, Margaret had a fall and was taken to the Nambour Hospital, where she was told she would no longer be able to care for herself, and her daughters were very fortunately to find a place for her at Allura Lodge, Maroochydore, where she was cared for by wonderful staff there until she passed peacefully away on the 19th of September. Her children, Christina, Lindsay and Marilyn and John, would also like now to take this opportunity to thank David and Beth, their children, for the wonderful care they took of Mother and including her in their family. Also to thank Les and Oriel for all they have done for Mum, as well as Jock, Des and everyone else who have contributed to Margaret's care over the last several years, who have visited Margaret at 309 and in the home. They would also like to express their gratitude to the staff at Allura Lodge for their kind and caring way they've looked after Mum. They feel that Margaret couldn't have been looked after better, and that where she was there. Margaret is survived by her 2 sisters, Anne and Jan, her 4 children, Christina, Lindsay, Marilyn and John, and her 9 grandchildren, Scott, John, Leanne, Andrew, Candace, Randall, Crystal, Timothy, Katie, and her 3 great-grandchildren, Sophie, Callum and Jack. An amazing and remarkable woman, yes. Could I please ask you all to be upstanding and join me as we sing the hymn, There is Sweet Rest for the Feet Now Weary. This song in particular was chosen by Margaret, and she wanted it sung today. It was never her choice to take on the medical work, but asked to do it, did it to the best of her ability, and many people are here today because of this. She picked this song because she said she was weary and it was time for her to rest. Thank you.